oops, where we're going to be focusing on 2020 progress in housing and looking ahead to 2021. My name is Kristen Baker. I'm the Executive Director of LISC in Greater Cincinnati, and we're so happy you've joined us today to hear from our panel of local and national experts talking about these topics in a really timely way. I think we all know that the housing challenges that face our community continue to grow exponentially, and the pace is not slowing down. So we're really happy you're here to share ideas with us. Please use the chat for any questions that you might have for this panel and discussion topics. We really want to hear from you and understand how you're viewing these issues and how we all can work together to create some new solutions. So you all are muted as participants, so the chat is the main function here. This session is being recorded should you have to hop out early for another meeting, and we are here to help navigate you through this. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Valerie Daly, who's Senior Program Officer for LISC Cincinnati, who's going to be moderating this panel today. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to join us today. This opening session of Housing Our Future is the first of our new year, and it's intended to look back at 2020 and the implementation of the recommendations of the strategy so far, also addressing the changing landscape of housing affordability and increasing the need for housing support across the community. In this session, we've invited panelists to share their perspectives on the need for systems change to address racial equity in housing, the role of philanthropy, investments in affordable housing, and the need for housing assistance through Cincinnati and Hamilton County. And I think we've got a good mix of panelists that can share a national perspective, the philanthropic perspective, and more of a service-based perspective. Housing Our Future was released in May of 2020. That feels like a really long time ago. And though much of the work of engaging stakeholders happened over the 18 to 2 month period before May of 2020, I think the recommendations prove to be very relevant still today. The strategy includes nearly 40 recommendations for improving the production and preservation of affordable housing, protection for vulnerable residents, and changes to systems which impact housing affordability in order to address the shortage of 40,000 units. And I just want to point out that's 40,000 households, right, tied to people, available to households with very low incomes in Hamilton County. The strategy is positioned to be the guiding path for affordable housing investments among partners. We've seen that lots of groups reference the housing strategy this year and last already. And the work across the county, and is available as a reference for shaping policies and programs to align with the needs identified by stakeholders and demonstrated by demographic data during the process. And I just want to add a note here, 2 points for simple framing. As I was thinking about preparing for this, I think 2020 in many ways was the year of the home, right? If we were able to stay at home, work from home, our house became where we worked, where we educated our children, where we quarantined, where we took care of our sick family members. And also in many ways, it was the year of the crises. We've got the health crisis tied with the pandemic. I think in many ways, the racial disparities with health outcomes became front and center for most folks throughout the country. Tied with the quarantine and the pandemic, we've got a lot of mental and physical health impacts that we've seen in the community. There have been economic impacts that have occurred, job losses, business closings, and housing instability, folks not able to pay rent, and rising rents in many neighborhoods and in Cincinnati, skyrocketing home prices, home sales as the year has gone by. And so that was 2020, all after, much of the work for Housing Our Future was done in 2019 and 2018. But I think the tying of the importance of the home and the crises and how important home is to folks makes these recommendations even more relevant to us today. Next slide. So we wanted to highlight just a few of the initiatives that have taken place in 2020. And I want to say some of these are in response to the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis, and special difficulty that folks had with housing instability. And then some of them are reactions to ongoing issues that we've seen in the community. So the Without a Deed program is a partnership between the Legal Aid Society of Greater Cincinnati, Volunteer Lawyers for the Poor, and Taft, aimed at providing support to protect real estate assets for families with low incomes. That's often for households that have been passing homes from member to member throughout generations, but don't have an official deed or ownership claim to that property. So that's a big help in many of our communities. The Do It Yourself Darlin program is a women-centered home repair and renovation service offered through Price Hill Will. That's a pilot that took place in 2020. And then CMHA has been able to offer bonuses to property owners through CARES funds who accept vouchers. So they're expanding the pool of available subsidized units. Next. And I just want to highlight there's been, from the county, the Community Action Agency, the city, there's been a lot of partners able to distribute emergency rental, mortgage, and utility assistance. And these are just a few examples. We've also been able to work, LISC has been working with Bon Secours Mercy Health in the neighborhoods of Bond Hill and Roselawn, with WIN and HOME, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, and working in neighborhoods to provide special assistance, connecting those residents with state and local resources, but then also without any sort of income limit, helping those folks that are facing challenges, the inability to pay rent or mortgage, connect with resources that can help them fill those gaps. Next. And then finally, I want to mention, LISC is working with Hamilton County Planning and Development Department and the Community Building Institute on 5 plans in Hamilton County jurisdictions. These are jurisdictions that have stepped up and said, we're interested in working on housing our future strategies in their communities and looking at how local markets are playing out, how trends are playing out, and how we can keep housing affordable to current residents and also be a place where folks looking for affordability and great neighborhoods to live can live. There's also the roadmap to address housing equity and Black ownership concerns in Cincinnati, along with the tax abatement remedy. And these both build on the fair housing assessment for Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and also the strategies, the actions outlined in Housing Our Future. The second class of the Real Estate Accelerator Lab happens, a program that's a partnership between the Urban Land Institute and LISC, and the first class of the Ohio Housing Development Training Institute, which sought to expand diversity and representation in real estate development in the community. And in closing, before I hand it off to Callie, I just want to note, these crises are not experienced evenly. Black and Latino households have lower median incomes. They were more likely to be cost burdened and experience evictions before the pandemic, and are most likely to be hardest hit by job losses as the result of the pandemic. So we know that the pandemic has deepened and worsened the disparities we saw before the normal times, early 2020 and before. I also wanted to note, the stat has come up in a number of the pieces of work that we've done. Nearly half of Hamilton County households have only one adult. That means that there's just a single person living in the household. There's nearly 120,000 of those households. The rest of them are a single parent with children. That means in the best of times, you've got one income that's supporting one person, one adult, one income that's supporting a household. And it leaves those households especially open to changes in income, loss of hours, loss of jobs. So I just wanted to note that I don't think it's unique to Hamilton County, but I think it's especially pertinent for this time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Callie Seltzer. Callie is the Director of Housing at LISC. She is based in Washington, D.C., and leads LISC's national work to create effective systems for affordable housing production to attract private sector capital, and to strengthen the affordable housing industry. And Callie's going to be able to give us some of that national perspective.
Thanks, Valerie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I wish I was in Cincinnati with you, but I am pleased to be here nonetheless. So yes, I'm the Director of Housing nationally for LISC, and we are in 37 cities and rural markets, but Cincinnati is one of our longstanding field offices, and happy to provide a little national context and perspective today. So we can jump into the presentation. So LISC Housing, when we talk about systems approach to housing, we're really saying that it's not just the inputs, right? It's not just the cost of land, the cost of construction, and limited kind of subsidy systems that have produced the challenge that we have. I think that aligns with sort of the recommendations from Housing Our Future, that it's really much larger. And if we can look at that whole landscape and figure out, what's really not working for the people that we all intend to serve and work with in our communities. So we do try to take a systems approach to production and preservation challenges that starts with that local vision. So I think you guys have set a really bold local vision with the Housing Our Future, and I absolutely love the recommendations, and I'm excited to talk to you more about them and figure out what really has legs, and how together we can solve some of these complex challenges. But the idea is, we've got that local vision and commitment from partners on the ground. Our team nationally, helps add a little bit of financial or policy acumen of, how do things flow from federal government, for instance, the emergency rental assistance programs. What will that do to help stabilize renters and be kind of a shot of liquidity into the system, and how do we help that be distributed in equitable ways, just to use a very timely example. But a lot of what we do is pooling capital, corporate and philanthropic and government, of course, that aligns with the gaps. And I think you have to get a little more forensic about those gaps early on. You guys have definitely done that in your Housing the Future. So we can move to the next slide. So our work really is investing in organizations, right? And strategies that are focused on wealth building through housing. And that means strategic leveraging of kind of broader anti-displacement work that your partners are doing, really doing a lot of work around cooperative ownership and alternative models to ownership, really trying to think about home ownership and wealth building not as a non-binary, if you will. It's not just rent or own. There's a lot of wealth building mechanisms on that continuum, if you will. And also supporting the local ecosystem affordability. So that's zoning changes and policy environments that also reduce pressures on affordability, and then figuring out how we maximize the capital that our partners are providing, and can we bring national capital to the picture as well. We can move to the next slide. So just to kind of ground us in the reality of the moment, and you guys certainly feel this in your unique way in Hamilton County, but a year ago we were talking about production and preservation before this massive loss of income and job stability, and it's really been so inequitably felt. And I think it's important to just step back and look at our renters, who's in our community, who's renting, and where are they in terms of a stability concern. So this spectrum here is intended to do that. We've been working a lot with localities to figure out equitable distribution of emergency rental assistance. What does that mean? How do we prioritize the hardest hit communities, places with persistent service job loss over the past almost a year, and also how do we use what we know about sort of these federal programs, so the tax credit and Section 8 and like some things that have some built-in protections for renters, but all that, in the persistent loss of revenue and income for properties, at the end of the day, our landlords are in pretty deep trouble, and our renters are, feeling that in a way like never before. And we can move to the next slide. So our sense is, there's sort of three types of solutions that we need to address a housing system that continues to fail our most vulnerable. That was the case before COVID, and it's just been compounded during COVID. So we have to address the immediate housing stability. The Treasury emergency rental assistance will do some of that. It's also very likely that it will be hard for more rural places and places with higher levels of home ownership to get those dollars out the door. And that's something I think we all need to be really aware of. A lot of really smart policy folks are predicting that a lot of this money just isn't going to get out the door, and kind of getting to the people that really need it is going to be a serious ground game. That your organizers, your community partners, your social service agencies right in the center there, trying to do this in a more equitable way. And also expanded eviction moratoria, of course, and really just that kind of cash assistance and cash infusion to the system. That's the immediate. If we can do that and stabilize households. And we also simultaneously have to support the continued solvency. So part of that immediate response will prop up affordable housing and construction that's in completion, and projects that our developers, our sponsors are trying to get done. But there's a step beyond that, of course, which is we're not going back to an equitable system. This was deeply fraught and deeply broken housing system everywhere, not just your market, not just your communities. So how do we get to something better? How do we actually regenerate better? And that includes really rethinking kind of the spatial mismatch, for instance, of housing and opportunity and transportation. I like some of the recommendations in the Housing Our Future, really thinking about the lack of transportation options. Well, a lot of that is, a function of how tax credit projects can get funded, or where where developers can actually acquire land. And we really need to start to push on the QAP, I think, at the state level, to eliminate some of that spatial mismatch and actually start to locate housing in the places that we know people have economic mobility and opportunity, that, we haven't always been able to do both, but we've got to walk and chew gum, I think. And we can move the next slide. So this is just, kind of how does LISC, approach locally driven housing solutions, the local being part of our name. But yeah, we're trying to facilitate the development of neighborhood housing plans, of course, and capacity building grants and technical assistance. And I think more and more we are being called upon to we're not just an input, we're an assembler of inputs, or we try to be kind of an assembler of inputs to help get at the really systemic issues here. So you guys know your local work even better than I do. I won't go too much into the specific solutions, but yeah, we can move it actually to the next slide. That's it. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and to talk about how the system's solutions in the Housing Our Future can actually be implemented. So pass it off to our next speaker, and hoping to generate good conversation.
Thank you, Callie, for that national perspective and helping us ground how we do the emergency response piece that we need to, and recover, and then hopefully rebuild into a more equitable space for all. Part of Housing Our Future is this call for new and maintained affordable housing units. And we'll be tracking that throughout the project. And so this is our first take of projects, of tracking that. How many projects are we actually funding through a variety of federal, local, state and that equated in 2020 to 859 units that were awarded funding in 18 projects. And that is $17 million of investment in affordable housing. And that's a lot, but it's not enough, as we all know. There were 3 projects that were designed to be mixed income, and there were 5 projects outside of the Cincinnati boundaries in Hamilton County. And the annual production goal in Housing Our Future is 2,000 new units of affordable housing a year. So again, that 859, it's a little bit of the way there, but not quite enough. And I should note that's a very ambitious goal that is going to take all of us doing things differently than we are now. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert Killens Jr. He's the director of the special initiatives at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. Robert's work at GCF aims to build a more prosperous Greater Cincinnati region by investing in communities to be vibrant and sustainable and provide economic opportunity. Robert?
Good morning. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I just would say as an opening that I'm super excited that LISC is providing great leadership in this area. So thank you for hosting this, LISC. What I'd like to say, just as a start, before I talk some very specific things we're doing, is that I want everyone to know that GCF obviously was a key initial supporter of the Housing Our Future work. I serve on the steering committee, but we have taken to heart the recommendations from the study, and so we're aligning much of our work in housing, in economic mobility, in racial equity and justice towards these recommendations. And so for us, Housing Our Future is very much a living document that we're using and that we are, letting guide much of what we do. So why don't we go to that first slide, that second slide, yeah. So the first thing I really wanted to emphasize is that for us, affordable housing really aligns with GCF's racial justice and racial equity work. We know that if we don't work on racial justice, we never get to racial equity. And housing is a key that we have to work on. When we think about the cost burden of housing keeps low-income people trapped in poverty. So if we're working on poverty initiatives wherever we are, and we're not considering housing, then we're going to have limited success, no matter how great the initiatives, the programs that we do. Second, as was stated earlier, and I think Valerie did a fantastic job of laying a great groundwork, so thank you, Valerie, for that. In talking about the disproportionality of these impacts. And so we know that the cost burdens are not spread equally, they're disproportionately hitting African Americans and other people of color, that poverty rates, again, are disproportionate. And then the eviction crisis disproportionately affects African Americans, in particular African American women heads of household. So if we are committed to racial justice, and we are, and if we're doing work in that area, and we are, by necessity, even if there wasn't a Housing Our Future, we'd have to do work in housing. So it's a great roadmap for us to align that work. Next slide, please. We also know from research that housing is a social determinant, meaning that having housing, quality, safe, affordable housing, affects our lives in ways that, again, Valerie highlighted earlier. In 2020 and continuing for 2021, our house is not just the place we go to sleep. It's now the place where we work. It's now the place where we educate our children. It's the place where we're providing, extended care. It's the place where we're doing so many things that the home was not, always designed to do. We can do them, right, and certainly in the crisis, but we're doing so many things in our homes. And so no matter what area we work in, if we're advocates for children, if we're advocates for education, if we're advocates for economic inclusion or business, no matter what we advocate for or what area we work in, right now we all have to be housing advocates. Again, I think that covers what I want to say on this slide. Why don't we go to the next slide? So how are we at GCF approaching and using the tools that we have to try to bring them to bear on this housing crisis, this affordability crisis? We're doing it through grant making, and we've provided support, as I stated, for the study, and we're providing support for the implementation, support to LISC and to other organizations. We are giving grants to build capacity of organizations to do this work. Right now, housing is, as I stated, an all hands on deck effort. And I think it's important that no matter what area, as I stated earlier, we're working in this community, right now, we all need to be thinking about the impacts that housing is having for us, so that we can move the needle. Some of the things we've supported in 2020, a number of grants. We supported the homesteading program. We supported the renter equity. I heard Callie mention that earlier, that there dividend housing, that there are more models than just the traditional models that have the goal of providing safe, clean, affordable housing, but also helping residents to build capacity and to build assets and to build resources. Because without them, they would never improve their economic standing, and that's what we want as well. We're working on and supporting policy and advocacy. We've long supported groups like HOME in their work, and some of that work tied to economic mobility of children. Often we don't think about that, but children who are displaced and who are evicted, they can bounce between schools. They can be in 2 and 3 and sometimes even 4 schools in a year. And then you test those children on a standardized test. We already know how the results are going to be. And so we've supported projects to try to maintain that stability in some areas. But we've done more. GCF has a voice, and we're trying to use that voice. You've probably seen that our CEO, Ellen Katz, has co-authored with Kristen Baker of LISC a couple of op-eds on affordable housing in our community. We've supported policy initiatives. We've written letters when necessary to City Council to push important initiatives and to support projects that we think need and deserve the city support. Most recently, the effort in Price Hill with Community Matters and OTRCH to get a project that deserves support, city support, and we're delighted that it did get that support. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're using our endowment assets to do something called impact investing. I think many of you know what that means, but I'm going to give a mini description. That's where we've taken some money that would have been invested in the stock market, and we're investing it locally with organizations to help them build their capacity to do work that they do to increase housing production, to increase affordable home ownership. So we've taken our dollars and invested in them. And there we're not looking for a financial return as much as we're looking for a social return, i.e. more housing, better housing, etc. And we're just looking to get the money back. So social return and then a preservation of capital. And that leads me to the last thing I wanted to talk about with a little depth, and that's our affordable housing impact investment pool. Again, that's where we are raising $5 million. GCF, we put in the first $1 million. we've worked with our donors, and if we added another 400,000, so we're almost at 1.5 million. And we're going to raise the other 3.5 million over the next year or so. And this is a partnership that we developed. This pool is a result of a partnership with the Cincinnati Development Fund to help do this pool. What does this pool do? Well, it creates a pool of dollars that provide short-term acquisition and pre-development loans. We know that the first step in the development stage is that pre-development, where you need money to develop, to do the architectural, to do environmental, sometimes to do demolition, to do etc. All of that pre-work before you can really bring a project forth and raise all the money. And those loans are typically very expensive, and sometimes they're hard to get. Often they're hard to get. So what this pool does, it is offering these loans to qualified borrowers, for-profit as well as nonprofit, especially for nonprofit developers, CDCs and the like, to qualify for these loans so that they can, first of all, get access to the capital, and then ideally get access to the capital at below market rates. We've also, with that partnership, we're able to leverage through CDF a $900,000 federal grant. So that 5 million is going to be augmented by at least another 900,000 of capital. So it's this, just having this project is importing new capital in. What I can say is that the project's off to a great start. This Affordable Housing Impact Investment Pool. I don't have the year-end final report yet. Should get it any day, but it was on track in its first year, starting in April. So not even a full year, about 8 months to do. We did 6 loans, and that's going to support the development of 140 new units throughout the region. So we're super excited. So in closing, I just wanted to say that Greater Cincinnati Foundation is using Housing Our Future as a living document. It's influencing our work in many areas, and we're bringing all of the tools that we have, our convening tool, our grant making tool, our policy and advocacy tool, as well as our impact investment tool to tackle this crisis. And we would encourage and ask all of you to find out, if you're not already in this fight, how you can get in this fight with us. With that, I'll hand it back over to Valerie. I think I may have gone over maybe 45 seconds, so pardon that, Valerie, but thank you for having me this morning.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your attention to detail. We are good on time. Thank you. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mark Lawson, the President and CEO of the Community Action Agency of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. He has a passion for working with those that face many challenges in our community. The Community Action Agency is helping to reduce poverty and increase self-sufficiency. I think many of us know it best for the Head Start program, but they have and continue to do a number of holistic things and are moving more heavily into this housing space as we address the COVID coronavirus pandemic. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Kristen and Liz, for this panel and all the work that you do. And wonderful panelists that you have here too. And unlike my panelists, I do not have a PowerPoint. So I will give you a roadmap though of what I'm going to talk about. And so first of all, a little bit about me, so you know where I come from, and a little bit about CAA, for those who don't know all the work that we do. And then I'll say a little bit about CAA and its role in housing the community. And then, as Callie said, I'm looking forward to a robust discussion with the group. It's great to see so many people on the call. So a little bit about me. So I was, prior to my role as CEO at Community Action Agency, I was a managing attorney at the Legal Aid Society for 20 plus years and did a lot of work in housing, landlord-tenant law, representing tenants, suing landlords, slumlords in particular, And then at the end, I was in charge of the foreclosure crisis response that we had, in charge of our consumer and homeowner work, representing folks in foreclosure, and suing the larger banks for treating folks poorly. So, and so I spent my whole career advocating for those in poverty. I was on the board at CEA for many years and board chair, and then transitioned there just in the last 2 years. So that's a little bit about me. CEA started, if you don't know, with Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in 1964, along with Legal Aid. So we're kind of cousins. And Head Start started in 1965. So we came out of the War on Poverty, all those programs. We've been doing this work for that long. So in addition to our housing work, we have workforce development, trying to get folks into careers with paths forward and upward. And as Valerie said, we have Head Start and Early Head Start, which is helping kids become lifelong learners from 0 to 5 for low-income families. That's free to them. We have over 2,500 families that we're helping with Head Start. And we also have other things like food pantries that have quadrupled or more. We used to have one a month. Now we're 4 times a month. Folks are just coming to us that we've never seen before. And so, I have some experience in the foreclosure crisis in 2008, the Great Recession. We had a lot of folks who had not interacted with social service agencies in the past. And now we're seeing that tenfold. So our food pantries are full. We have more people coming to us for emergency services than ever. And it's quite a struggle just to get to those folks that are desperate for help, but we're doing the best we can. And we're all working remotely, so which is added on the difficulty. And I think, as our panelists have said, there's already a housing crisis before the pandemic, and now there's a pandemic and the resulting economic collapse, and that's why we're seeing so many people in need. And so at CEA, we really are focused on the emergency services right now, and they all affect housing. So we have rental assistance, mortgage assistance, utility assistance, which includes water and sewer. And in the past, we may have allocated maybe 150,000 or so for rental assistance, and we didn't really have much of any mortgage assistance. And now, we got $4 million just at the end of last year from the state to do mortgage and rental assistance. We're about to get another 3.4 million from the state to do mortgage and rental and utility assistance, and another 8 million from the new $25 billion rental assistance program. So we spent, for example, 2 of that $4 million in just 2 months at the end of last year. And so we used to spend about 150,000 in a whole year. So that's a little bit about the need that we're seeing. People are desperate. People, like I said, are not used to coming to social service agencies. We're finding that a lot of people have lost jobs through no fault of their own in industries that are struggling to come back. And so one of the things about CEA, they all look different in every state and every county. And the idea of it when it was proposed was maximum participation of those in poverty. And so we have folks experiencing poverty on our board. Our strategic plan has focus groups. We dive into the community to really find out what the needs are. And then the idea is that we're nimble enough to adapt and change and, help those folks. And so, one example of that, we have over 2,000 folks in our rental assistance pipeline that have contacted us that we're desperately trying to get to. And so in talking to those families, we found that a lot of people have lost those jobs. So we stood up a program with some partners with Talbot House, Urban League, Easter Seals, and Cincinnati Works, and realized that folks have lost jobs but still have skills and are marketable, but maybe they need to rethink those skills and remarket themselves and think about how those skills could transfer to a different job where they can get hired from employers that are actually hiring. And so that is up and running, and the Hamilton County Commissioners thankfully saw the importance of that and funded that with $500,000. And that's been really successful. One example of a person that we've helped with all these programs really is somebody who came to us as a single mom, mother of 2. She lost her job, like I said, through no fault of her own. and she was couch surfing and staying in cheap hotels, and came to us, and we were able to stabilize her with rental assistance, getting her first month's rent, security deposit, moving expenses. And then we now have her in our rapid reemployment program, which is what we're calling that program I described, to get her on into a new job with those skills. And as part of that program, it's cool that we've realized there are a lot of barriers to employment that our families are seeing. And so we have money set aside to break down those barriers, whether it's transportation issues or childcare or whatever it takes to get those people, whether it's buying uniforms or clothes for the job. And we're also able to pay those folks while they're in the program, $12 an hour. So just an example of how we're being nimble and responding. And the idea of the importance of housing that I think Robert touched on. So many of us in this field have known forever how devastating evictions can be on families as well as foreclosures. And it's just exacerbated all the more in the middle of the pandemic. This is no time to be looking around for housing. And, pre-pandemic, it was bad enough. It was impossible to look for a job, keep a job when you're trying to find a roof for your family over your head. And also, it was impossible to stay healthy. I mean, you're not thinking about preventative health care if you still are trying to find a roof over your head. So that's the importance of housing. And now it's exacerbated because of the pandemic, because you don't want to be out looking for a house or a home in the middle of a pandemic and be set out of your house or your apartment and have your stuff on the street. So, and I think Matthew Desmond in his book Evicted has kind of made it more mainstream, and everybody realizes the devastation of evictions and how kids will be uprooted from their educations and moved from place to place, and how difficult that is on families. And of course, foreclosures, that's coming down the road too. We saw that in 2008, 2009, and the devastation on families and on the communities where they live, where vacant housing just spiraled those communities downward. So lots to do about that. And, we're full in the game on helping with rental and mortgage assistance, and utilities obviously are important too. It's part of housing. And so a lot of people are behind on water and sewer bills and utility bills. And, we have assistance available. It's just the difficulty is really getting to those folks. And so it's almost, we're in the tactical weeds of trying to hire more folks. This week, I think we're going to hire 10 more people just on the front lines to get through to those people and let them know that they're in line and can be served. And along with this, I wrote an editorial piece a while ago in the Inquirer about the need for a moratorium, and thankfully now that moratorium has been, extended until at least the end of March, and so that goes hand in hand with rental. And so, thankfully for that, I mean, there's no reason somebody should be evicted from their apartment while they're waiting in line for us through no fault of their own. So that eviction moratoria is super important. To help get people through. And just to touch on what Robert said about the racial issues involved here. So the folks we're seeing, 79% of the folks we're seeing are female-led households, and 81% of the people we're helping are Black Americans. So it is disproportionately affecting the Black and Brown communities. And we're well aware of that. And especially in the Hispanic communities, we have a person that we hired to go into those communities and work with our partner agencies to find those folks that need help and get them, hooked up with services. But so that's kind of in a nutshell, and I'm looking forward to a great Q&A session. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. And I think we're exactly on time. So everyone did wonderfully. We are getting questions coming in. I'm going to start out with maybe a big, hairy question. And think about your organization's role and who else needs to be at the table. So we've heard a lot about the challenges families are currently facing. We've heard about how they disproportionately impact Black and Latino households, single mom households with kids. And as you think ahead to 2021, I'm interested in how you're thinking about how you respond in this emergency still. I feel like we've all been reacting to this emergency, on full drive for 9 months or whatever it's been now. How do you address that emergency? Think about that, but then also think about how you contribute to more equitable outcomes, right? We can't just meet the base need, continue as normal, keep doing what we're doing, we're going to get the same outcome. So how do you think about that for your organization, and maybe what else? I think everybody's talked about the interconnectedness of schools, of education, of transportation. What else needs to happen to drive more equitable outcomes for families? I think you can all lend an answer to this. I'll let whoever jumps in first.
I'll start. I think, I hate to use the term holistic, but that's what we try to do at CAA. And, we have a policy of no wrong door. So anybody who comes to us, whether if they're behind on rent or mortgage, we're going to ask them what their job situation is in addition to their housing situation. We're going to ask them if they have kids that could be in Head Start, and then vice versa. If somebody comes to a family is in Head Start, we're going to see and help those folks if they get behind on rent or mortgage, or if they're thinking about they need a different job. So that's one thing that we're doing internally. And then, of course, I tell my staff all the time that we can't go it alone. So we have tons of partners, and we're working in partnership with all kinds of people. And I mentioned some earlier. But with the rental assistance and mortgage assistance, we're working with People's Church, Corinthian Baptist, Mercy Ministries, Easter Seals, Santa Maria. In some ways, players that weren't really in the rental assistance game before, but we realized the need to help get that money on the street. What I'm about is making it as simple as possible for families to get money and get stabilized in housing. And so we can't do it ourselves. It definitely takes all the partnerships.
I can add on a little bit. Or Robert, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Callie. I'll go after you.
Okay, I'll just connect one thought. Thinking about the immediate need and emergency rental assistance, and part of our role as kind of a national organization is to engage with, in this case, Treasury, a agency that doesn't normally run housing programs, and that's the channel by which we're going to. The states will all be receiving the emergency rental assistance, the $25 billion that was passed at the end of last year, whenever it actually got passed. But I think there's a lot of bluntness in legislation always, and we have to connect the picture. So there wasn't even anybody kind of in the Treasury office in the past administration looking at this stuff. Really, it's just kind of been empty. We just found out today, there's two kind of seasoned housing policy advocates, very sharp people that will be in that office, and we got several requests for them, because we think there need to be more equitable principles around how this money goes out the door, set at the federal level. So you need to be able to distribute rental assistance to those who are most vulnerable to the health and economic impacts of COVID. And also those are often the hardest people to reach, right? But there's some tools. There's a emergency rental assistance priority index that Urban Institute has put together, and you can see on a census tract level based on housing instability before COVID and the compounding housing instability and the greater people where people are at greater risk of eviction and homelessness, and it actually gives you an index of how to distribute these dollars, which I think is a really powerful tool for policymakers and for local folks on the ground that are, looking to form and shape policy around something that's kind of nebulous and coming from the feds and needs to get out really fast. So I think that's really fantastic. We're also leaning heavily on them to, administer the funding through the existing channels. So your continuum of care and, all your partners on the ground that have those direct connections to people, and also setting aside money for small landlords And from a kind of longer term preservation perspective, we know that small landlords, who depend on that cash rent every month, they're in a tough spot. And there's a lot of institutional capital out there that might be looking to buy those properties in the coming years, already is in a lot of markets. So making this, hit large and small landlords, we think is really important for what the affordability that's left in the system. And then also just kind of removing cumbersome documentation and hardship requirements for renters, and just really trying to keep this really simple, and get, all those holistic, as Mark mentioned, the rental counseling is key. It's not just about the dollars in hand. So if you guys have things you would like us to advocate for, we're out there with a lot of the other advocates, trying to make sure that this hits the states in a way that they can actually administer and form policy around. So that's all I'll say on the rental assistance part.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things. I'm going to go quick that I've tried to make notes. So one of the things that GCF started 3 years ago is we started a series called Racial Equity Matters, and started doing this training to share with individuals throughout our community that that racism and structural inequity is built into the fabric of the country, unfortunately. And so we get these disparities based on the construction of our country. And I think Callie alluded to that earlier. And so unless we address those, the system will always produce what it's produced. And so we've been training people in that. And we encourage you, if you're interested, to visit our website and learn how you can get involved. In June, we launched a Racial Justice Fund, given all the civil unrest, what happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera. And our board committed $5 million specifically targeting racial justice. And we've started doing work in that area. But we are also internally, we have turned the mirror on ourselves. Thing is, the lingo goes to talk, but we are really trying to walk the talk. And so all of our policies around hiring, around everything, we've undergone a gender audit to be gender friendly and making sure they're not disparities based on gender. And we have a racial equity council. So we're doing a number of things institutionally so that we hold the mirror up to ourselves. But we've also had to respond, as was stated earlier, with the crisis in flexible ways. We partnered with the United Way, and the goal was to raise $5 million for COVID. We raised 7.3. We got that money out within a matter of weeks. So that caused us to, again, make some additional changes in our philanthropy. When you're in a crisis, you can't have all of the normal processes and procedures. You need to have accountability for sure, and transparency. But it caused us to do that. And just two other things I mentioned. One thing was with PPP, we focused early on and did a lot of communication trying to connect nonprofits that were eligible under PPP to resources and to providers that would help them. And we had a little success there. And then the last thing I would say, and I want to amplify a point that Callie mentioned earlier, we can't just build the systems that were broken and return to where we were before. Then we'll return to the crisis that previously existed. And because what we know is this, and research shows it, that all of these crises going back to the 2007, 8, 9 housing crisis and economic downturns, they all amplify and make worse the disparities that exist. So we don't move forward. We know in the last housing crisis that so many African-American homeowners lost their homes because they were in predatory loans and they were foreclosed on at differential rates, that we really have to approach this work, and this is the conviction GCF has, that we have to approach this work going forward with a lens of racial equity and racial justice, so that we can not reinforce and just return to the system before. We want to return to a more just system, because everyone benefits from a more just system if we have the willingness to build it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robert. And I'm going to try to transition to a question around home ownership. And Callie, I think maybe I will send this in your direction. We've talked, I think, a lot about rental, and rentals are generally more affordable for folks, but we do have a fair amount. Robert talked about Black homeowners. We've got communities with strong traditions of Black home ownership. Those same communities are often facing rising housing pressures, and folks are feeling threatened, feeling pressured, may want to take the opportunity to, cash in. And many want to stick around, but are feeling pressure. And those same communities can't be as welcoming to folks if they're not as affordable any longer. So that's a whole lot to ask about. What are some national best practices for helping current homeowners that do have affordable units that are in communities where they want to stay, that they enjoy? How do they stay successfully? How do they get supported in staying? And then how can we create affordable home ownership opportunities when we've got such hot markets that are driving up prices in most of our communities?
Yeah, housing is so, not to be too academic about it, but like so countercyclical. Like when people really need the help the most, there's the least amount of money in the system for things like expanded tax relief, for vulnerable homeowners. But I think that is and should still be seen as a best practice. And I know it's one of the key actions that you all identified in Housing Our Future. And yet we also know our cities and our counties have no money right now to offer such relief, and are, in revenue crisis. But I think looking a little bigger to say, what's the long-term, the 10, 15-year benefit and value for our community of a temporary or shorter-term tax relief for vulnerable people, for vulnerable households. I think we have to look a little bit beyond revenue shortfalls a year or two from now. Of course, we need federal assistance to kind of cover the delta there and write the check for cities and counties and states. But yeah, I also just firmly believe that we've set up a lot of programs across the country, for down payment assistance and helping people get into home ownership. But what we don't do is maximize counseling. There's never enough dollars for counseling on the back end, and that's, I think, when you look back at like the wealth stripping and the tremendous loss of particularly Black wealth and Black homeownership in the last crisis, if we had more prevention counseling and ongoing counseling for people that hit that cliff, if you will, we would have saved, I think, a lot more, retained a lot more Black wealth in our communities. I think the data says that would have been the case as well. So that speaks to a need for grant dollars. It speaks to a need for creative use of HUD home ownership counseling dollars. There's definitely money out there that sometimes doesn't get tapped into. So I think those are a couple ways we can protect people once they're in this system. And also we've got to deal with the very biased appraisal system. I personally believe we should be creating a whole new cohort of appraisers of color, people that actually, can break down, hopefully, some of this just embedded racism in our appraisal systems. So those will be my three kind of, one's kind of that short-term tax relief, and then all the way to kind of the longer term. We've got to rethink how we devalue these communities, and have been for so long. And when people exit, they're not getting the money that they should have gotten for their house if they were living in a white neighborhood. So those are some system system-wide problems I think we've got to address.
Maybe now transitioning back to rental, a question of what can we expect with the Biden and Harris administration, both in terms, I think we've got some indication of what we can expect in terms of an eviction moratorium being extended, and some of those emergency dollars flowing through Treasury. But what else might we expect in terms of vouchers or longer term support for affordability?
Do you want me to take a stab at that, Valerie?
Sure, and probably Mark might have something to add too, I think.
Mark, you definitely should.
Sure. Well, you're right about the extension of the moratorium and how important that was. So, things are looking pretty good there. To touch on something Callie said about the $25 billion rental assistance. So, Treasury is in charge of that program, put out an FAQ that wasn't all that great. And so I'm glad to hear, Callie, that you're working on some advocacy there, and so are we. And maybe with the new administration, Treasury, things could get better. I mean, some quick examples about that: they allow some of the money for utilities, but not for internet and cable. And so we all know right now there's a lot of folks using telehealth, for example, that would be in dire straits without that. And obviously, a lot of kids are home doing remote learning. So that's just an example of not thinking that all the way through about utility assistance. Another thing that you touched on, Callie, was making it simple for folks. It's not simple. There's a lot of documentation involved to prove that you're poor. And I get tired of folks having to over and over again prove how poor they are. Everybody's affected by a pandemic, and a simple self-attestation ought to work, not showing documents that prove that your income has somehow been decreased because of COVID. And then another example is we have some landlords that do not want to participate, and there is a provision with this legislation that money can go directly to the tenants if landlords don't want to cooperate. But there's a 21-day hold period with a certified letter to the landlord, and by the time 21 days is up, somebody's going to be out on the street. So that's not great either. So we're looking forward to advocacy and some changes coming down the road with the new administration for sure.
And then Callie, I don't know if you have any insight on, the potential of more vouchers or longer term subsidy for units.
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen sort of, if we actually get a boost in the long-term rental assistance. There's a lot to be worked out there still, and I think we'll know more probably in the next month or two. There's actually industry resistance as well to some of the policies, so I think everyone kind of needs to look deeply at how beleaguered the system is and who's getting hurt by it. And of course, a massive expansion of vouchers and rental assistance is what makes the production of new affordable housing possible. We did get a floor on the 4% low-income housing tax credit, which is like such a nerdy thing that we've all been fighting for so long, but it's major for housing production and for projects that would pencil. And I think in your market, that could be huge. It looked from a Novogradac study, I'll drop the link in here. It looked like, we might get 3,200 new units in Ohio this year because of that. So hopefully a chunk of those will be, in Hamilton County. I'm, counting on Ohio Capital and, partners like that in your market to figure that out. But it does mean that projects, and especially with debt as cheap as debt is right now, a lot of projects that wouldn't pencil a few months ago now might. So that's there. That's a great thing. But yeah, on the longer term, kind of creating rental assistance or Section 8 as an entitlement program, it's unclear. That would be the goal, though, of advocates to get that as an entitlement program, so we could actually expand, that rental assistance.
Valerie.
Go ahead, Robert.
Just one point I wanted to make. The moratoriums, and we need them, we have to have them, but at some point they're going to be over, and there's I guess hundreds of billions of dollars of unpaid whatever, and that's going to have to be some kind of reckoning, and I hope that as a country we can take the steps to settle that, because and Callie raised this point earlier. There are landlords who need to be paid. Those landlords need to pay banks and other mortgage holders, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a because you don't want to see all of them lose out. So anyway, I just think that that's a reckoning that we have to deal with, and I hope that we have the political leadership at the national level, both sides of the aisle, to address that in a forthright way. So,
Robert, you exactly predicted the next question. So this question is, how does the moratorium protect and not protect families, right? Like, we've got some emergency assistance, we've got some cash that we can give tenants and landlords to help cover some of those expenses, but generally not all of them. There's a lot more need in the community than we have resource. And I keep thinking we're just pushing the can down the road. It's great to see the moratorium extended, but it's going to come to an end, and that reckoning is going to happen probably sometime this year. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to end with one question for you all. And I want to say, if you shared a question in the chat, thank you so much. We are going to follow up with panelists and work to get you answers if we weren't able to include your questions here during the discussion. We had a couple of questions about specific types of partners, whether it be banks or real estate agents, in furthering affordable housing, ensuring equitable communities. So in the city, the city's role in supporting affordable projects, communities that we all want to call home. So what are your thoughts about partners that might be sort of directly connected or adjacent with housing? What would your advice be to them about what they can do in 2021 to help us continue down this path of providing more opportunities for affordable housing? So what's a partner, like a bank, like a real estate agent, like a city, a local government? Who's a really important partner that we maybe haven't talked about today, and what role could they provide in advocacy or funding or support for furthering affordable housing?
Well, that's a big question. So I'll take a stab at that. So, banks and bank foundations are super important. I mean, the big answer is all of those people that you mentioned need to get involved and on the same page. And I think they're getting there. We had a great program that we stood up when I was at Legal Aid, a homesteading program that we did a pilot project in Price Hill with So Will and several partners. And at the time, there were many vacant homes, and there were a lot of folks that couldn't get conventional mortgages. And so we tried to marry those folks together, and we ended up, getting a lot of those homes out of from the land bank that were in tax foreclosure. And we found families that could do a little sweat equity, and we designed a land contract with zero interest where they owned the homes after 5 years. And the way to scale that, though, and it was a great project, but it was small. And to scale that, you need a bank or CDF or somebody to step in and provide that subsidy. So that's a perfect example of where a partner like a bank can step in and help make a project go forward. And then on advocacy and the things that the city can do, there's some things percolating around that we ought to do that some other communities have done that we're advocating for. Sort of a pay to stay ordinance would be great. If you could afford rent and you're in an eviction court for non-payment of rent, and you can bring all the money and all the fees, you ought to be able to stay in your home. And so that's just one example of something where the city can get involved and work on. The other thing, and this touches on the earlier question about homeownership that Callie answered, was the tax abatement program needs to be more equitably used. And I'm thinking of folks that are in neighborhoods that have been in their homes for a long time on a fixed income, and there's some gentrification, and then there's tax abatements for those folks to come in, but the people who have been there forever are struggling to pay their taxes. And this goes hand in hand with what Callie said too about needing more money The new $25 billion is all for rent. There's nothing for mortgages. And we need much more money for mortgages going forward. And then something you mentioned, Valerie, is we are actually clearing the decks for folks with that Ohio Home Relief money. There's no cap. We've cut checks for $15,000, $16,000 to help folks with mortgage arrearages. So we are clearing the decks for folks. And we also are partnering with landlords, affordable landlords, especially public housing, CMHA. We've cut checks for their tenants on which is helping the Public Housing Authority and helping the tenants. So those are just some thoughts.
Valerie, I had two. I'll try to be quick. I had two thoughts in terms of people. I agree with what Mark said. Every one of those institutions that you mentioned should figure out how they can participate. I'll put in a selfish plug here. One way banks, investors, and others can immediately join in is consider joining our Affordable Housing Impact Investment Pool. Their money is guaranteed. They'll earn 1%, but the principal is guaranteed, and they'll have a big impact on production. So sorry for the shameless plug. But two other things that I want people to think about, and again, Callie mentioned this earlier, we want to prevent as many of these foreclosures as we can, because one thing that happened in the last crisis, and Sister Barbara Bush, I had a webinar and she brought this home in a very powerful way. When we have these foreclosures that often happen, often out of town, large investors with pools of cash, and the stock market has been crazy. People are sitting on, an institution is sitting on lots of cash, and they can buy up these homes, which, we might think our housing prices are high, but they're not New York, California, so they are still very cheap. So we will lose much of this housing stock if we're not careful to out-of-town investors who will turn them into renters, and that lost wealth that Callie mentioned would be lost to our community. And then the last thing I want to just amplify, we've talked about the need for this affordable housing, and almost always just from the perspective of how many units and the cost. But think about it. If we're talking about building 2,000 units a year, if we're talking about an average investment of 100,000, it's more than that, but let's keep the number simple. We're talking about $200 million a year in new construction and renovation. What if we had a concerted effort to make sure that that work was done by local builders and developers? How many people would we have to employ through programs like the ones that CAA runs with Youth Build and all these other programs that train and develop the unemployed in our communities? If we could employ them and make sure local contractors got that work, then we can see this issue as both a crisis and the opportunity to grow our economy and get people who need the work employed. So I just think we have to think about this problem holistically. And if we do, we'll see not only the crisis, but the opportunity that's also presenting us right now.
I think Robert said that so well. And for us, it's centering developers and entrepreneurs of color in our housing work. Our communities and our local economies really are weakened when these entrepreneurs are not able to pursue development projects because of a lack of, access to land and capital. And kind of like it or not, real estate just remains this really major wealth building vehicle everywhere. And so many good community driven projects never see the light of day. So, CDFIs work hard to kind of get to yes on these projects, but we have to do more too. And I think like achieving a lower interest rate in this environment is not enough. Like we really have to find new ways to shoulder the risks of development with these partners, and the HCTI training and some of this work is being done in collaboration with all of you all. But I think it's you got to look at look really closely at where affordable housing wealth, or I should say housing and real estate wealth, where does it actually accrue, and where does it get distributed? Who are the beneficiaries of that wealth in the short and long term? I think there's a strong local economy argument for investing in these developers and entrepreneurs of color up front, because our it should be no surprise that our real estate system has been firmly entrenched in white wealth for a very long time. So yeah, we need to look a little more closely at sort of the unseen kind of complicity, I think, of that across CDFIs, everyone, we're all in this system trying to get production and units, and it's hard to do it. And often we lose sight of that bigger picture, that, the people that we're all here actually trying to be, of some service to, if you will.
Thank you, Callie. We're just a couple of minutes over, and so I want to point people to the chat. There's a link to a survey. I will give you fair warning. It is a very detailed survey, but we would love to get a variety of viewpoints. If you've already taken the survey, thank you. But it will help us set, there's so much in Housing Our Future, right? There's so much that we talked about here today. So this will help us set priorities for the year that we can also share with partners in this work, because it takes a large collective effort. And there are specific questions in there about which strategies in Housing Our Future can push the hardest on this racial equity question. So we would love everyone to complete that survey. Also, shameless plug, if you have time and you want to fill some space in your day, we've got all the recordings from previous sessions from 2020 recorded. Robert, you made me think of this when you talked about the economic impact of affordable housing. It's not just providing housing to folks that don't have much money, but it's an economic driver for the region. So there's a whole session on that topic. So you can find those there. And thank you to our panelists. I think this was a great kickoff to, I feel like we can finally say 2021. We're firmly in it now, almost February. And thank you everyone for attending. And we will see you, we'll have a regular schedule. We're working on programming them now. So we'll see you soon. Thank you all.